Hello, my name is Claire Holliss. I'm a history teacher and I'm one of the authors for the A New Focus on British Social History textbook from Hodder. When I was writing the textbook, I particularly focused on LGBTQ plus history. So as it's currently LGBTQ plus History Month, we thought it would be a really nice idea to share some of the ways in which this textbook can help you teach this topic. Now, in this video, I'm going to highlight one of the making history sections of the textbook. These chapters appear throughout the book, and they're designed to show students how history is made by shining a light on the people who work as academic researchers, as archivists, for example, how they think about the past and the traces it leaves, and some of the challenges that they encounter, for example, when finding people in the archives and the records. Now, we included these sections because one of the things we were really eager to do when we were writing this textbook was not only to help you tell a range of fascinating stories about society in 20th century Britain, but also to give you some ideas about how you could get your students thinking about history and using these stories to think about history in new and exciting ways. Teaching LGBTQ plus history offers some brilliant opportunities for doing just that. And in this video, I'm going to talk about some of the ways in which you can get your students thinking about evidence. So, moving over to the example of the textbook I've got here. Now, this is the Kindle version of the textbook. In the printed version that you might have, this is on a double-page spread. So, this double-page spread comes at the end of the chapter on the 1930s and 1940s, up to 1945. And as you can see, this making history section is linked to the question, where do we find evidence of past lives? Now, the materials on this double-page spread highlight some really interesting pieces of evidence drawn from two different archives, which are linked particularly to LGBTQ plus history, and also explore how the archives in which this evidence is kept might shape the kinds of stories that get told about the past. So on the first half of the double page spread, on the page I've got up here, we've got one piece of evidence in particular that comes from the National Archives. And I'm just going to make this bigger. So this piece of evidence is a police report that was made by two officers who were observing the Shim Sham Club. This club and other social spaces which catered to LGBTQ plus people and other marginalised groups are discussed earlier on in the chapter that precedes this section. Now, by itself, this piece of evidence offers a whole wealth of information about the kinds of things the police are interested in and are observing. I particularly enjoy, sort of halfway down the source, this man who's under the influence of drink, who's wearing a fancy hat and blowing a squeaker. Someone was obviously having a really good night. But if we focus on LGBTQ plus history in particular, it's really interesting right at the top of this piece of this document to see these two women of the lesbian type being observed and described. Now, that's quite interesting in thinking about what kinds of ideas the police have, the kinds of categories they are using, and the ways that they are describing people. This piece of evidence as well is also a really nice example of some of the limits of what we can find out from documents like this. So we can tell from this document here about what the police are observing about the people who are entering and leaving the club. And this gives us some kind of hints about what's happening. So we can see people wearing evening dress, people under the influence of drink, this person who keeps going back and forward on a bicycle, the person who's complaining about the price right at the start of the record here. And that gives us some hints about what's happening. But there's still a really fascinating air of mystery about what's going on behind that door, because the police are sitting outside of it. In a similar sense, we are getting a sense of the police's perspective. They are describing these women of the lesbian type. They are using terms, phrases like men of colour. But what we don't get from this is the people they're describing's perspective, how they thought and felt, and how they might have described themselves. So this is a potentially really interesting case study of the strengths and limitations evidence like this, which is drawn from official sources and outside observers, might have for a historian. Now, in a slightly different sense, in this same section, we've also got a couple of pieces of evidence that are linked to a different archive. In this case, the Hall-Carpenter archive, which was created by the Campaign for Homosexual Equality in 1982 in order to preserve the history of the community. Again, these pieces of evidence taken from this archive can give us some really interesting evidence and open up some really interesting questions about who is involved in activism. So students might be interested in looking at this badge here to see it's issued by the lesbian and gay Christian movement. And on the following page, this leaflet here shows them that there are trade unionists being involved in the campaign against Clause 28, as it was at the time. Now, going into this even further, this leaflet in particular, for example, might give students a real sense of the kinds of organisation that are going on behind activism. So the range of activities that one day of action might include: lobbying local government, leafleting, holding rallies and demonstrations. These sources might also open up some really interesting questions for students about what counts as evidence, particularly if they're used to dealing with more sort of standard sources like speeches, newspaper articles, etc. Getting students thinking about what a badge might tell them about the past could be really, really interesting. We can also consider the different kinds of stories these different kinds of evidence might allow historians to tell. How might historians' interpretation of the past be shaped by the kinds of evidence they are engaging with in these two different archives? Students might consider how historians might use the evidence held in the National Archives, like this police report, to uncover how people with power felt and thought. But they also might consider how historians could still use this kind of document to put together fragments about the lives of the community that are kind of pieced together from their encounters with the state. They might consider how historians who are looking at the evidence in the Hall-Carpenter archive might perhaps tell stories that are more focused on activism, for example. Staying with the Hall-Carpenter archive, you can potentially also use this part of the textbook to take these questions even further. This page also includes some information not just about the evidence, but about the archives in which this evidence is held, including in this case the quite dramatic history of the Hall-Carpenter archive, which includes being kept in someone's flat, almost being shut down entirely in the 1980s. Those kinds of details potentially open up some really interesting questions for students about what kinds of evidence get preserved, why our police report, for example, is being kept safely in the National Archive, and what kinds of evidence are in danger of being lost. In using this kind of material in lessons, you can start to encourage your students to think about the kinds of stories about the past that are likely to be told, and the kinds of stories in the past that might end up being silenced. So I hope you found that useful and interesting as an example about how you might use this particular section of the textbook. In my next video, I'm going to look at a similar section which focuses on one particular piece of evidence linked to the LGBTQ history, and consider about how you might use it to continue thinking about some of the questions we've already discussed in this video, but also how you might also think about questions about language and how we describe and talk about people in the past. Thanks very much for watching.